Hey, everybody, welcome to our Black and Data Justice Day. We are joined by Dr. Angel Durr. We have a very fantastic presentation coming up. Looks like she's providing some information in the chat. Check that out if you want to learn more about her. Thank you again for joining us. Reminder that this is being recorded. My name is Kimberly Diaz, and I am the co founder of Black Tides. I'm also the informatics lead and obviously helping to curate Black and Data Week. All right. So Dr. Durr, she's fabulous, fantastic. She is volunteering her time just like all the other speakers this week. So we are so thankful for her joining us today. Dr. Durr, go ahead and do your introduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And yes, I will introduce myself. And thank you for being an excellent DJ as well. I hope y'all enjoyed the Gap Band. That's my favorite way to start Fridays. So, yeah, I'm just excited that y'all are here. I'm really excited to be participating in Black and Data Week. And I'm excited to bring our data skills to a topic that I don't think gets enough attention, which is Black people. And so I am here to kind of talk about that. I had approached Kim specifically about doing a presentation, or actually really just asking if we ever partnered with organizations like Data for Black Lives and stuff like that. And at which point she offered to let me kind of do a presentation this week. So I'm just excited to be kind of sharing this topic with you all. It's a topic that I've actually never gotten to speak about, but I've always wanted to. So you guys are kind of guinea pigs for this conversation today. So I look forward to hearing your feedback. And I'm trying to take what is kind of somewhat heavy topic and bring it into a sort of different direction than maybe what you're probably expecting. So even if you get kind of like a little distraught at the beginning, I ask that you kind of stick with me, and we'll take it somewhere that you might not expect we're going to go. So let's get started. So numbers don't lie, quantifying Black lives is my topic. And where do we go from here is really the question that I'm asking today. This is definitely, like I said, going to start out in talking about some heavy data that I don't think we really give enough attention to necessarily. And rather than talking about someone else's data, let's kind of look at our own. I am Dr. Angel K. Washington Durr. I am a speaker, a data activist, data strategy consultant. I'm an academic researcher. I also do autism advocacy. I have autism, so I'm really a big proponent in talking about what that looks like for Black and brown folks. I'm a creative, I'm a mom, and I'm a survivor. And when I say that, you'll probably learn here towards the end of my presentation what that really means. I'm also a lecturer in the University of Nevada, Reno Online Analytics MBA program, so I teach online as well. Since I am a Ph.D. If you'd like to connect with me, feel free to do so. I'm always looking for more to grow my network further. So let's kind of kick things off. The cyclical devaluing of Black lives is where I kind of want to start, and thinking about from womb to grave. What does that mean? And what do we mean by devaluing? I think Michelle Obama is really a great person to kind of start this conversation off with. And it's really a story of generations of people who felt the lash of bondage, the shame of servitude, the sting of segregation, but who kept on striving and hoping and doing what needed to be done so that today people like Miss Obama would wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. And I think we can all sort of identify with that feeling. And that feeling is something that I want to capture in this presentation. You know, we keep on striving and we do what needs to be done. And that's going to be a theme that I talk about throughout this conversation today. So I'm going to be presenting some different texts that I would love for you all to connect with if you've never read them before. I think they're really great pieces of work that really help to kind of pull together some different aspects of our story that I don't think we really give enough attention to. And I think this specific text by Ta-Nehisi Coates is amazing, and he writes it as sort of a story to his son. And and a letter to his son, kind of explaining, slavery and the history of Black lives in our country in a way that a child would essentially understand, which I think if some of you are also parents, you can probably identify with having to have that really difficult conversation with your child of, this is our history. And I'm sure you've learned a little bit about it in school, but maybe you haven't learned the full story. And the most intriguing part of this is the data piece that he starts out with, because I never realized the dollar amount, I guess, that was placed upon our bodies. I knew, numbers about slavery and things like that. But when it comes to data, knowing that at the onset of the Civil War, our stolen bodies were worth $4 billion in today's money, I think is kind of amazing to think about. I don't think we really quantify our lives in that way. But knowing that more than half of American industry, all of American railroads, workshops, and factories combined could not equal that dollar amount either. So all of the capitalism that was being driven in our country at that time was still not equal to the value of our human lives, which I think is really staggering to think about. And we were essentially America's primary export as well, which in the American history, there's been a lot of different types of exports, from weaponry to goods that are contributing to the manufacturing of other products. But thinking about human beings being an export, I think puts things into perspective in a way that is really difficult, but is also a conversation that we have to have with our next generation, unfortunately. And the richest people in America at that time obviously made their riches off of our bodies. And I think that's a beautiful way to put it. It's also a rude awakening for people that have never seen the data presented in that way as it relates to our bodies. And he continues on, and this is his son, by the way, which I think is so cute. Here's what I would like for you to know. In America, it is tradition to destroy the Black body. It is heritage. Enslavement was not merely the antiseptic borrowing of labor. It is not so easy to get a human being to commit their body against own elemental interests. And so enslavement must be casual wrath and random manglings, the gashing of heads and brains blown out over the river as body seeks to escape. There is no uplifting way to say this. I have no praise anthems, nor old Negro spirituals. And I mean, wow, like the way he writes, like I said, I really encourage you to go check out this book, because the way he weaves these words together is just amazing. And the way he weaves data into that conversation and presents it in a way where the numbers are leading the conversation just as much as his prose, I think is really beautiful. And it says a lot about his data storytelling capabilities, the way he can do both at the same time. But it also really illuminates how our bodies were truly a commodity. And that's kind of something that is a theme that continues throughout the history of the United States in a way that I don't think we think about enough, especially as professionals now working in a heavily technical field. How are we still being essentially commoditized in a similar way? So here's some additional data on the Black enslaved population in the United States. I think it's very important to know exactly how many. When we're talking about data and telling the story of our history, I think it's important to know just how many of us there were that were actually enslaved, how many of our ancestors were in those specific situations, and how many people were actually free as well in our population, because I don't think we talk about that in a way that's truly realistic. And also seeing how the population just exploded post-slavery, I think is important as we're understanding kind of our historical growth as a people within society, the larger society. And as we can see, our numbers just exploded substantially throughout this time, from 1790, when we kind of see slavery really starting to take a stronghold in the United States, all the way through the Civil War, when obviously slavery was disbanded. And yet our populations continue to grow substantially. And so when thinking about how we've been commodified, it's interesting to see how our value continues to increase over time as our population also increases. So let's talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, because I think that's an important piece to juxtapose today and what's going on today as we look at the value of Black lives as well. And I think this quote is extremely important when we're thinking about the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement. Strangely, in a nation that once put actual prices on Black human beings, that assigned monetary value to sons and mothers and brothers, we're not willing to see the worth of Black human beings. In a country that once treated people as property, we're now putting more value in property than in those people. And I think that in essence is a big, obviously piece of the Black Lives Matter movement, is that the most ironic thing about this whole thing is that we went from being worth $4 billion to not being even valuable enough, as valuable as property, physical property. And yet at one point we were essentially physical property as well. And so it's just a really interesting thing to wrap your brain around, to think about the history of our country and how, on one hand, we can be treated like property, and on the other hand, now looking back, we can be devalued at a point where we're not even as valuable as property. And it's a very interesting and yet strange position to be put in, as I'm sure you all know. And then looking at the data as it relates to the Black Lives Matter movement, I think is very important too, because this is probably the largest movement in US history, which I had no idea until I really looked at the data that was true. I'm thinking about all of the different protests that have gone throughout history and all of the, people that have participated in those protests. I'm sure we've all seen these pictures of everyone in DC at these large marches, and probably thought, there was so much political activism that's taken place throughout our history as a country. It is really interesting to think that the Black Lives Matter movement and all of that activism is still the largest movement in our history as a nation. And I think it also says a lot about how people feel. At the same time that we're being devalued in one essence, we're also being valued in the fact that this movement drew people out in a way that we have never seen before. And from a geographic standpoint, it was spread across the country in a way that we've really never seen movements be spread either, which I think says a lot about the future of this movement in our country and the potential growth for the movement as well, because it's interesting to look at the data in this way and see that despite a lot of people, like even myself, thinking that the Black Lives Matter movement sort of kind of happened and then sort of died out, it's interesting to see that it really set a precedence for movements moving forward, as far as the number of people that were participating in that movement. And then when we look at the data as it relates to the geographic spread, it's also really interesting to think about the fact that 1 in 5 Americans actually participated in this movement, which is amazing. And then of those 1 in 5, 19% said they were new to protesting. So I think that is also really encouraging information to know that, we've gotten the ball rolling now. Kind of let's see where we can take this movement moving forward. And I think seeing data about this kind of information is very powerful, and is the perfect use of our skill set as data professionals to be able to draw out more of these data points, because I think this is really the tip of the iceberg. I want to see more now. I want to see us really pushing the data forward on these types of topics. And so that's a big reason why another reason why I thought this was an important topic to share, because I think it'll start a conversation amongst us as data professionals to say, where else can we bring value to the conversation and utilize our skill set as data professionals to really drive our own movements forward in this particular area. And 95% of the counties that participated were mostly white. So I think that's also really interesting too, that a lot of these geographic locations had very high white populations, and at the same time, the participation in the movement was still very much present. So it also says that even though we may be outnumbered in a lot of these areas, it doesn't mean that there's no strength in our numbers, and there's no value to what we can bring to the conversation, and then what our allies can bring to the conversation as well. And the Black Lives Matter movement, which merely asks society to acknowledge the disparities faced by African Americans and the fact that their lives are valued less than other demographic groups, not that Black lives should be valued more than others, sparked an outcry from people who likely don't understand the depths of injustice that Black Americans have endured for centuries. And I think that is a really important quote coming from an economist of all people, talking about the economic side of this conversation, which I think is just as important as the social change aspect of it, because I think understanding the economic value of our lives throughout history really aligns with the social value of our lives throughout history as well. And so she talks about how public school teaching of racial oppression could enable U.S. society to grasp the roots and effects of racial and economic inequality, because it's just as important to talk about the economic inequality that has coexisted with this racial inequality. And we've seen that a lot in the news at this point, as they're trying to, outlaw even just talking about these topics in public schools, which is really unfortunate, because as far as we are pushing the movement forward, there's always that persistent pressure against us and pushing us backwards at the same time. So tracking African American economic mobility progress, and let's talk about the civil rights era versus today, because I think that we often talk about the civil rights era and we make these correlations between that period of time and the Black Lives Matter movement, and how, obviously there's a lot of work being done that is being devoted to making positive changes within our specific part of the American society. But it's also interesting to see just how simultaneously much has been done in those time periods, but also how little has really changed over those time periods as well. So white families continue to far outpace Black families in terms of wealth. The typical Black household has less than 1/10 the net worth of the typical white household in both 1968 and 2016. So as we can see, while the overall net worth of our households in America has increased substantially, there seems to be this same gap that exists between our households in terms of economic mobility. And so while there was so much work going on in 1968 and the 1960s around civil rights and us continuing to improve our economic situations just as much as our social situations, we see that a lot of the gains that were made have sort of dwindled and diminished over time, and have really not raised as much as we would like them to. And I think a lot of that is because, as much as a lot of us are progressing and getting and growing our net worths, there's people on the other side who are at the same time decreasing their net worth. And so in the end, it sort of balances out. And so the question that I often ask, and I want to dig deeper into because of this kind of this presentation, is how can we achieve economic mobility that doesn't come at the cost of other parts of our Black population? Because we want to achieve economic mobility, but it shouldn't come at the cost of people within our own culture. And I think that's really an interesting piece of the conversation that doesn't get talked about as much. And I know even within my own family, while I've been achieving and doing things, at the same time, I have family members who've whose economic situations have gotten worse, and they found themselves incarcerated and on public assistance. And so it sort of balances out when you have someone who's got a high net worth, but they live in a family full of people who don't. And then they're reliant on that one person with the high net worth to sort of help the other pieces of parts of the family sort of achieve the same type of economic mobility. And that's sort of the frustrating part that I think doesn't get enough attention, unfortunately. And the income gap between Black and white families, with that in mind, is almost the same as in 1968. So the gap, as we can see, we did achieve minimal amounts of success, but then that sort of dwindled off. And really, it kind of mirrored the same type of economic mobility that was happening in the white part of our society. So we're not really seeing the same gains over time that we would expect to be seeing. In fact, as we see in around 2010, at a point in which the white income sort of finally began to kind of trickle upwards, our economic situation went in the opposite direction. And that's really unfortunate. And we can see a lot of these deeper dives that have happened in our own economic situation over time, especially in the late 80s and early 90s, when we know the impact of Reaganomics was, really changing our households in a way that was positive for some, but also very negative for others. And a smaller share of Black Americans are in poverty now than in 1970. And I think that that's at least some encouraging piece of this economic conversation. But the percentage of Black Americans that are living below the poverty line was much lower in 2018 than it was in 1970, but is still twice the rate of white Americans. So that's another important piece. But I guess the good thing in this conversation is that the amount of people living below the poverty line, even though it's sort of a little bit skewed, it has sort of stayed pretty stable throughout time, whereas we can see with the white population, the white population has stayed sort of stable over time, whereas we can see with the Black population, it has been up and down, up and down, up and down. And I think that says a lot about our piece in the economic conversation, because it hasn't been as stable as it has been for the white population in the United States. And I think that's the reason why social movements like Black Lives Matter culminated at the time that they did, because, we can see that the economic mobility that we've perceived to have happened over time was really not really happening at all. And while some people were in a better situation, a lot of people were poorer than they've ever been. And that's the unfortunate part about economic mobility, is that while it can be beneficial in the short term, it's how do you kind of keep that momentum moving forward and not lose momentum and go in the opposite direction, which we've done many times throughout history, unfortunately. And that is the perfect storm for social movements to happen. The more people are impacted economically, the more drive there is to kind of push social movements forward to change that situation, especially as the white members of society maintain sort of stable economic mobility over time. And the divide has narrowed between Black and white employment rates as well. And so the share of employed Black Americans was closer to that of white Americans in 2019 than it was in 1968. So that's encouraging. But at the same time, we also see that a lot of these kind of dropping points in the white society have impacted Black society at a much larger level than they have for the white population. And we can see these same dips occur on both sides, but the dips for us are much much deeper. And I think we can see that right now with the layoffs that are happening. A lot more of the people that are being laid off tend to be minorities and people from marginalized populations. And that's just a recurring theme. When we see these economic downturns, yes, everyone is affected, but everyone is not affected in the same way. And that's just a recurring theme throughout our history as far as economic mobility. Roughly 1 in 5 Black Americans are living in poverty. And yes, it has come down in the last 50 years, but that is still a really huge number to think about. And wrapping our head around how we fix that is really, I think, important, and is an important use of our talents as data professionals, figuring out ways to drill into the data and figure out how we can theorize some ways to actually combat those diminishes in our economic mobility. So again, Black Americans are typically more subject to the whims of the economy than their white peers, which we definitely just saw in the data. During recessions, the percentage of Blacks who are unemployed drops more than the share of whites with jobs. And when the market improves, to the same respect, white Americans are the first to get hired, which I think we've all seen within our own lives as well. The crisis of intergenerational poverty and low socioeconomic outcomes among Black Americans must be properly contextualized. Many Black Americans have succeeded in the face of substantial adversity and labor market discrimination, and despite of limited access to wealth, networks, connections, and educational opportunities, still exceptionalism in the face of adversity is not a sufficient policy prescription. And I could relate to this quote so much, because I think a lot of us think, if we just work hard enough and we change people's perspectives and we go after the things that people tell us we can't go after because of intergenerational poverty, that everything's going to be okay. But in the end, it isn't sufficient. It doesn't fix the systemic problems that we're trying to overcome in our society. And it doesn't make all of that intergenerational poverty just disappear. If you're making a lot of money, then all of a sudden everyone's depending on you as the person to actually take care of everyone in your family. And I've been in that situation. And so succeeding for some of us, it isn't a prescription to solve this problem for the larger population, unfortunately, and really can be just a recipe for burnout as well. And when we're looking at earnings, which I'm sure we are all very familiar with the data as it relates to earnings. And while we lag behind whites in educational attainment for a while, that disparity has really that gap has very much so closed. In fact, African American women remain the most educated group within society. So the concept that, we just don't have the educational attainment that the white populations have, and that's why our wages are so much lower. But unfortunately, that's just not true. And so economists have had to step in time and time again and prove that the wage gaps cannot just be explained by simple things like educational attainment or the types of universities that we've attended and so on and so forth. I mean, for the same role with the same experience, we're earning about 20% less as Black workers versus especially Black men who are competing with white men. But the median earnings for Black men in 2019 only amounted to 56 cents to every dollar earned by white men. And this gap is wider than it was in 1970, which I think is also very telling. So again, we're going backwards. All this, all the prosperity that we think we've gained over time since the civil rights movement that, people fought really hard for is actually taking a turn in the opposite direction. And even with things like having a Black president and all of these things that have sort of happened over the historical timeline since, we're not seeing the kind of economic growth that we would expect to see with all of this educational attainment and all of the other things that we're doing in our lives to kind of push our economic economic mobility forward. And I think it's very important that we see this type of data and understand our place within the larger society and our place within the larger economy as well. And this is a really great book, too, that I think everyone should read, How to Succeed in Business Without Being White. It's an oldie, but it's definitely a goodie. Earl Graves was the late founder and publisher of Black Enterprise magazine. He passed away, unfortunately, but he said, money makes people listen. When you have it, then you have something others want and need. When you don't, you become invisible. And that's sort of very telling of the situation that has happened in our part of the culture in America, is that, you know, it's between the haves and the have-nots. And even within our own Black society, when we see Black Americans who do have money, they have a lot more ability to kind of push the narrative forward in the direction that they want it to be pushed in. But that comes often at the expense of Black Americans that are on the other side of the economic chain, unfortunately. And we're all in IT, so we should be able to identify with this. We are, as IT workers, we're supposed to be the best paid amongst all professions, one of the best paid. And unfortunately, being the best paid doesn't equate to we get jobs. In fact, we account for 2.6 out of every 100 computer workers in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, which I think is very telling. While we are getting this educational attainment, it's still just as hard for us to achieve that economic mobility without having to be put often into a position where we're working for an organization that doesn't really value diversity and equity and inclusion. Maybe they value diversity, but equity and inclusion is something very different. And so, unfortunately, for the majority of our jobs, they're still going to white people. And that is, I think, a hard pill to swallow when we see all of our colleagues out here doing amazing things with their skill sets and having to constantly go above and beyond their white peers in terms of educational attainment, in terms of the ability to work within the organization and show outcomes. And it shouldn't be a situation where we have to constantly, like the old adage says, work twice as hard to get half as far. But it unfortunately still very much is. And Congress, if you've never heard of Color of Change, this is a great organization that is really working hard to change the Black tech agenda by creating this Black tech scorecard that ranks congressional efforts in tech policy. And if you've never heard of Color of Change, I encourage you to get involved. They are really putting pressure on Congress as it relates to things like ethical AI, ethical tech, making sure we are in the conversation as it relates to technology. How is technology impacting our populations? How is the advancement of society impacting our populations? And I think far too often, as I'm sure we all know, big tech, having the money that it has and the influence that it has, is allowed to kind of do what they want to do in society, especially with our government not being as aware of the things that are taking place. And honestly, that has encouraged me personally to really look into data activism and utilize my skill set for more activism-based work where possible. And even at the point of, you know, do we need more data professionals to actually get into the legislature and the government and start influencing policy in a real way? And I think the answer is yes. As much as we're having these conversations about using ethical models and all of these things, which I think are amazing and very important to the conversation, we also need to be on the front lines leading the conversation, which is what Color of Change is also trying to do. It's trying to put Black and brown people into elected offices so that we can actually have a say in this conversation, which I think is going to be critical to our advancement within the larger society. And Congress has the power to make tech also safer for us. And unfortunately, right now, it isn't safe. Just like it's not safe for us to be in the physical world, it's still not safe for us in the digital space either. And that's something that we have the power to really have an influence on. And so, again, I encourage you to get involved with organizations like Color of Change, which are really trying to have an impact on our role within the larger tech conversation. And then as we talk about, this is an amazing book as well. If you're looking for another work that is really focused on weaving the data into the larger conversation and story as it relates to our history and the economics of our history in this country, just understanding how properties are valued and how our properties are valued lower, which impacts, so many other aspects of our society, so many other aspects of our neighborhoods. I think it's really important to read books like this so that you educate yourself on the data that surrounds our historical timeline. From a research perspective, it's easier to pinpoint racial bias in housing prices than to quantify the impacts other manifestations of bigotry have on our physical being. Few metrics capture the intersectional nature of devaluation, like infant and maternal mortality rates, which, as we know, obviously infant mortality rates are much higher among our part of the population than they are among white populations. So again, there's a penalty for being Black. There's a penalty for living in Black neighborhoods that extract wealth and opportunity and years of our lives. And that's because of the health outcomes that come with being Black as well, obviously, which we're going to get into next too. So racial disparities in health are equally as stark as racial disparities in socioeconomic opportunity, unfortunately. So it's not enough that our the economic impact of our part within the larger American society, but that also has an impact on our health as well, which I think is really important for us all to take note of, especially because during COVID, the life expectancy overall of American citizens dropped, unfortunately, but that had an even larger impact on the Black portion of society. Obviously, like that theme keeps recurring. Whenever we see something negatively impact society, we see that even more so negatively impacts our subset of society, and life expectancy is no different. And I think understanding this model for Black social capital and social mobility in Black communities is a really great model to use as we're looking at the individual facets that make up socioeconomic opportunity. It's not just things like education or employment. It's also housing. It's also political institutions. It's also healthcare. And it's the access and opportunity in these areas that ultimately leads to social capital. And then from there, we see Black social capital, which includes social movements and Black-owned businesses and faith institutions and professional and civic organizations. And then all of that leads to socioeconomic mobility. So it's not just one piece that ultimately leads to the mobility of our place within society. It's all of these pieces together. And that's essentially a very unique feature of our population versus the white population within American society, which it's not nearly as nuanced as our population because of all of these various moving parts that contribute to systematic racism. And systematic racism is really fascinating when you pull it apart piece by piece, because the way that it has been mobilized against us with all of these moving pieces makes it really hard to just tackle one piece at a time, which I think throughout history we've attempted to do. But when you have all of these different pieces moving together at the same time in the larger system, you really have to have a plan that will tackle all of these moving parts at the same same time, which is really challenging to do in a society as large as ours. If you want to improve health incomes, you've got to improve criminal justice policy, education policy, wage discrimination, and the like. All of these things are interconnected. If we have the range of people working on the range of issues that are at play and assuming that Black people are not the problem, then we can take small bites of that elephant in many different sectors, leading towards a more equitable society, which I agree 100%. These are interconnected moving parts that have to be taken apart piece by piece at the same time simultaneously, which is definitely an overwhelming type of agenda to be able to push forward. But if we start taking it apart piece by piece, especially if we contribute our skill sets to having an impact on each of those areas, I think it's something that we can really work towards collaboratively pushing the agenda for. And at the current trajectory, it will take about 95 years for Black employees to reach talent parity across all levels in the private sector. But if we address the major barriers that hold back our advancement, we could cut that duration by about 25 years. So by utilizing the talents of people like ourselves, we can take about a fourth off of that timeline, just right off the bottom. And that means that there's a greater opportunity that our children will be able to see the realities of this happen in their lifetime, maybe in their children. And I think that is really something encouraging to think about, because it took us a really long time to get ourselves in this situation. So it's not going to happen overnight. Unfortunately, the fix is not going to happen immediately. It's going to take a while, but it's also going to take concentrated effort towards all of the pieces of the problem and not just one piece. And I don't know about y'all, but one of the biggest issues that I have with nonprofits is that they look at tackling these individual components. And unfortunately, that's not going to fix the larger issue at hand. That's not going to fix systemic issues like what we experience with racism in America. It's going to take people working on all of these aspects interchangeably and in partnership with one another in order to really move the needle. So I hope that within our children's lifetime, we see some of the fruits of that labor. So here's where we kind of turn things in a different direction. So what do we think as it relates to success in the racial achievement gap? And what can psychology and cognitive science kind of teach us as far as how we could potentially move the needle beyond just looking at things like some of the larger pieces like economic mobility? Like, how can we really change things and move things in a positive direction starting today? How can each and every one of us really have an impact on this? And I think my favorite part in this conversation is talking about people in the sociology discipline and how a lot of this information, these specific conversations that have already been had can really be brought into our conversation as it relates to Black economic upward mobility. And these theories can help us drive the conversation forward. So a theory of human motivation from psychologist Abraham Maslow theorized that human decision-making is really guided by a hierarchy of psychological needs. We all have a hierarchy of psychological needs, and there are 5 core needs from the basis for human behavior modification. So if we want to change human behavior, we need to look at these 5 core areas and needs that kind of are associated with each of them. And so I don't know if we've seen this before. A lot of people have encountered this at some point, but the hierarchy of needs is a pyramid with basic needs at the bottom and more high level intangible needs at the top. And a person can only move on to addressing the higher needs whenever the lower needs are first met. And so it's important that we look at the pyramid holistically in its entirety. And I think it's important to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a hierarchy of inequality and really see how this corresponds to what we're seeing in terms of Black economic mobility, and how, because these needs haven't been met, successfully, we see that the current kind of economic situation and socioeconomic situation that we're in now was really bound to happen, unfortunately. And I think it's really important to look at theories like this as we have the larger conversation around economic mobility. And so at the very lowest level, we have things like our physiological needs, which are, the need for air, the need for food, the need for water, the need for rest, shelter. And a lot of organizations tackle, some of these higher level needs like educational attainment and achievement without focusing on the lower level needs first. If somebody doesn't have food at home, doesn't have shelter, doesn't get adequate rest because maybe they work all the time, it's going to be really hard for them to meet the higher level needs because they haven't gotten this lowest level taken care of first. So by starting at the bottom and then working our way up, we can see how we can truly have a positive impact on Black society within America by taking care of our basic needs first and then working our way up the pyramid. And in the United States, unfortunately, communities of color face a steeper climb to fulfill their basic needs, which is a really big part of why we're seeing things kind of go backwards, because as much progress as we've made in terms of social movements, we haven't taken care of the basic needs first, which is why organizations like the Black Panthers started by giving people food, giving people shelter, giving people a place to rest. Those are the things that we have to tackle first and foremost before we start thinking about employment and health and all those other things that are really at the highest, at a higher level of the pyramid. So when we look at just people that are unhoused within our society, a lot of people complain that, these unhoused populations, they could easily go get a job. But if you don't have shelter, if you don't have food in a food security, it's going to be really hard for you to keep stable employment. And that's the reality of economic mobility for all parts of our society. And at the very top is self-actualization, which is where you can start growing as a person and really focusing inward on yourself as an individual and looking at the whole self and saying, well, how can I be a better human being now that I've gotten my basic needs met? But in order to get to that level, you have to have love and belonging. You have to have safety and security. You have to have your physiological needs met, and you have to have your esteem needs met as well, meaning that you have self-esteem, you feel a desire to be respected as a person, you have friendships, you have people who love you, you're accepted, you have a stable home, you have stable employment, you have stable health. Those are all critical before you can get to that level, which a lot of us are lacking in our Black communities, unfortunately. So it makes it really hard for us to get to these higher levels where we can have these larger conversations around our part in society. A Black man was murdered by police, and my white peers just moved through life like absolutely nothing happened. Meanwhile, I'm fighting back tears to push through meetings. How many of us can identify with this quote? Well, this quote personifies that our need for safety is not addressed. So most of us are living at the very lowest levels of that pyramid. And so it's really hard for us to have these larger systemic conversations around our self-actualization and growing as people, because our basic need for safety is not met. And that's really kind of a basic need that we all should be able to attain within society before we ever expect to achieve any kind of true economic mobility, which is why in a lot of our families, I'm sure we've seen, like, over time, like, maybe you had family that was doing particularly well, but the next generation was probably doing worse. And then maybe the next generation was doing better. And then the next generation maybe went down again. And we see a lot of this variability instead of consistent growth over time, because these basic needs are not being met. And so people are not able to achieve true economic mobility generation after generation, unfortunately. And so the Maslow hierarchy of needs and inequalities is very much as true when it was created as it is now. And so this quote kind of speaks to that as well. Black people in the United States don't even enjoy the basic human needs of safety and security in our own country. That fact that we have to live in constant terror of losing our lives to the very people charged with protecting us means that we don't make it past the second rung of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So after Maslow passed away, Scott out and said, well, I think the way people look at this pyramid might be kind of incorrect, because for a long time within society, people looked at the hierarchy of needs and said, okay, well, once you reach the top of the pyramid, you're good. And everything's, you're kind of, you've reached nirvana at that point and there's nowhere else for you to go. But unfortunately, that's not really the way that Maslow intended for us to look at that hierarchy. It's not like you get up to the top and you just stay there and you're done. Life is not that perfect, unfortunately. And so the pyramid fails to capture the fundamental distinction between deficit and growth needs. So Kaufman proposed that we instead take this pyramid and put it into a sailboat. And so there's 3 such needs, which are feeling safe, feeling of belonging and not being rejected by others, and protecting our self-esteem. And so we need to feel safe in both the physical realm and in the interpersonal realm and in our relation to ourselves. And with that in mind, growth is a direction, not a destination. So we are growing as people, but we don't get to some ultimate growth point and we just stop growing. No, over life, things will change in our lives where we'll have to grow and change in many different ways, depending on the circumstances that life throws at us. And that's a hard lesson for a lot of us to learn. I know it's a hard lesson for myself. And so there are deficit needs, which dominate our motivation and trump any higher needs when they're urgently lacking. So, for example, if I'm underwater and I don't have any air, then I'm not worried about self-realization. I need air so that I can breathe. And so the more precarious a physical need becomes, the more it preoccupies our mind. And if you're underwater and you need to breathe, that's going to be the only thing that you're able to think about. Hunger is a very powerful motivation in that way as well. As long as my access to things like food and water and shelter feels secure, then I don't have to think about them. So the deficit needs thus become mainly activated when we're lacking them, and with that in mind. So here's the sailboat that Kaufman proposed. So life isn't a project or a competition. It is a journey to travel through a vast blue ocean full of new opportunities for meaning and discovery, but also danger and uncertainty. And that's just the reality of life. We don't get to the pyramid, get to the top and say, yay, we made it, we're done. It's not a competition in that way. And with holes in your boat, you can't go anywhere. All of your energy and focus is directed toward increasing the stability of the boat. The human needs that compromise the boat are safety, connection, and self-esteem. Security needs that, under good condition, work together for greater stability. The hull of the boat is what keeps us afloat, offering security from the waves. It represents the deficit needs essential for survival. So safety, as we see, is the very bottom of the boat, because that's the most critical piece. If we have a hole there, our boat will sink, no matter how many of the other pieces that we have at the top. And connection is another critical piece with that. So safety and connection, I would say, are 2 of the most important pieces of that boat, which ultimately provides us the security that we need to be able to just be at a base level. Then we have that self-esteem that kind of keeps our boat steady enough to be able to continue on its trajectory. And then we see exploration, love, and purpose come into the conversation. And that allows us to push our boat even further and grow as individuals over time. But depending on the experiences that we encounter in our journey in our boat, things may change with each of those different areas. And that's the important piece to keep in mind. It's not stagnant. It is very much a constantly moving type of conversation that we have to have with ourselves. And it's very personal to each and every one of us. We're not competing with anyone else to get to the top of the pyramid. We're just trying to keep our individual boats afloat. And with that in mind, when we talk about economic mobility and socioeconomic mobility, things like measuring GDP is not enough. When we look at this this boat and even the hierarchy of needs, we see that there's a lot more to being a whole person and being our whole selves than just having money. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the conversation. And the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is an association of 38 nations. The goal of the organization is to promote economic welfare, and it coordinates the efforts to aid developing countries outside of its membership. As a result, its programs help promote reform in more than 100 countries worldwide. And they look at more than just GDP, because economic development is more than just GDP. It's not just, the output of the country. It's not just how many of whatever they're making. It's more than that. It's access to housing, it's access to health, it's knowledge and skills, it's the environment in which these people are living in and the quality of that environment. It's safety, it's work-life balance, it's social connections, it's civil engagements, it's subjective well-being, but it's also income and wealth. But that's just one piece of it. And work and job quality is one piece of it. And we measure them in a lot of different ways. We look at inequalities between the groups. We look at inequalities between the tops and bottom performers. We look at deprivations in any of those areas. We look at averages. And then for future well-being, we look at natural capital, economic capital, human capital, and social capital. So it's not enough just to say economic capital. We have to move beyond just thinking about the overall economic mobility of a society as just their financial output and their economic capital, to say, let's measure beyond that to really see what makes a country a good country and what makes a country really have the economic mobility that we would like to see globally for all of our citizens across the world. And it turns out a number of more recent studies that reported happiness is strongly positively linked with the change or growth in GDP per capita from year over year. So at the same time, happy people produce more and perform better in terms of economic mobility. So if we're not happy, then nothing will change in terms of our economic mobility. And I think that's an important thing to hear as Black people, because we focus so much on the pain and the hardships that we've experienced, and we don't think enough about the importance of things like happiness. And are we happy as individual people in this room? Are you happy? And if you're not, it doesn't matter how much money you make, you're still not going to achieve the type of economic mobility that you expect. So with that in mind, there is a gross national happiness measure, which is a stark opposite of the GDP. And it's a measure of economic and moral progress, which I think is an important piece of the conversation. And the king of the Himalayan country, Bhutan, introduced in the 1970s as an alternative to GDP, which people were like, what? And rather than focusing strictly on quantitative economic measures, it actually looks at happiness by looking at some of the quality of life indicators, which I think are just as important as measuring economic well-being, but they're a lot harder to measure sometimes. And I think that's an area that we could all lend our skill sets to as data professionals to understand even more as it relates to the Black society within America. So the World Values Survey points, and he says, if the government cannot create happiness for its people, there is no purpose for the government. And I think that's a beautiful way to look at it. And so if our government in America isn't creating happiness for us, that's really the larger question that we need to be asking ourselves, is how can we create a government that actually creates happiness for its citizens, so that we actually produce at the level that you would expect us to produce at, especially as our birth rate declines and things like that are happening in the larger part of society. I think that really speaks to the fact that happiness is not being put in the position to have a positive impact on our decision making within our society, as it should be. And that's just universal to all members of America. The World Values Survey points out that while income has skyrocketed in developed nations compared to their pre-World War II levels, the level of happiness found in those countries has remained nearly static. The survey found that materialism appears to be a happiness suppressant. So as much as, it's great to be able to be the person that doesn't have to worry about paying our bills in our family, materialism can be a happiness suppressant, which I think is an interesting thing to think about as all of us being professionals that have achieved a certain level of economic success. We expect with that success will come a certain level of happiness, but it doesn't come. And it's because we're not balanced in all of these different areas. We're just looking at one piece of the conversation. We're not looking at, do we have the cultural diversity and resilience that we would expect to have? Do we have the community vitality? Is our psychological well-being taken care of? Is our health being taken care of? Are our living standards what we would expect? Do we use our time in a way that shows that we love and are happy with ourselves? Do we have the ecological diversity and resilience that we would expect to have in order to achieve a maximum amount of happiness? So it's much more than just economic mobility. It's a whole picture that contributes to people's overall well-being and ultimately happiness. So here are some factors that are part of the gross national happiness measurement. So community vitality, time use, standard of living, ecological resilience, good governance, psychological well-being, health, cultural diversity. These are all parts of the conversation. And so we kind of bring this full circle and say, when people are having the conversation and saying, well, we need to come back to Black joy because Black joy matters just as much as Black lives matter. So how do we harness joy to keep us anchored to this world? And that can be our guiding light, our guiding force, a North Star of joyfulness. So instead of looking to, create an equal society, we should be looking to how can we create joy in our individual lives? Because that's something that we actually do have control over. It's hard for us to be able to control the economic systems that work all around us, but we can, as individuals, control the amount of happiness that we have within our own individual lives. And the amount of joy that we're able to bring to our individual lives ultimately will impact our economic mobility in a way that focusing on the larger system is just won't happen for each of us as individuals. So Black joy in itself is an act of resistance. So when people say this, I hope now you understand from an economic perspective and a sociological perspective, what does that actually mean? Well, it means that by looking at our individual levels of happiness, we are able to achieve larger socioeconomic mobility within society than focusing on all of the negative aspects of things that are happening all around us. And this has been a really challenging lesson for many of us to learn. I know for myself, especially, it's been really challenging. So how do we still have joy? I'm sure that's a question a lot of you are asking. It's definitely a question that I asked. How do we still live our authentic lives despite the threats to our bodies? We dance, we sing, we create and prophesize the futures we will manifest. We commune with our ancestors, we empower each other, our siblings and our neighbors, and we resist. Resist the idea that Black folks are only sad people with sad stories. Resist any attempt to steal the joy we have died to have. I believe that the best way to conquer oppression is to survive, and our joy holds us and aids in keeping us alive, ensuring that we are not forgotten and erased. And I think that that is a beautiful way to kind of bring things full circle and understand at an individual level, despite the larger data that is happening all around us, what is something we can do to positively impact the trajectory and socioeconomic of Black people? It's to bring joy into our conversations. And despite everything else, be happy and be joyful. That is something that's just as much been a part of our history as the enslavement of our bodies and the commodification of our bodies. It was our ability to bring joy into all of those experiences that I think sometimes we forget in modern society. And this comes full circle for me because this is a time that I myself have been impacted. My mother, after getting out of incarceration, was killed and shot in South Dallas. And so this conversation that I'm having with you all today is a conversation that I've been having internally with myself for the last year and a half, because I was at a point where I was really angry and I was really upset about the price that was paid for being Black. And I was really angry with the societal impacts of what that has meant in my own life and for my own family. And so being able to talk about how we can bring the conversation back to joy was just as important for me as I hope it is for each and every one of you, because healing is done in layers. You have to continue to spiral through the same emotional experiences until there is no electrical charge left to trigger you. And so this presentation is dedicated to the memory of my mom, Lynetta Mae Washington. And hopefully you all found as much value in it as I found in actually bringing it together myself. Here are some amazing texts that you can also read on your own time if you want to learn more about these topics. And what I will especially bring you to is Data for Black Lives, which is an amazing organization which is really working to drive this conversation forward by actually quantifying our individual lives and the number of lives that are being lost, including my mom's, in this conversation. But also looking at things like Black joy, knowing your price, measuring what counts, working for your happiness, measuring happiness, the economics of well-being, the metrics of happiness. So I want us to take our skill sets as data professionals and move beyond measuring things for other people and measure things for our own community and see how we can drive the conversation forward. And that's what I'm going to challenge each and every one of you to do moving forward from here, because I hope that you all will be encouraged to find a way to use your data skill set to drive activism as a result of this conversation. And that's where I leave things.
Thank you, Dr. Durr, for that very inspirational talk. Oh my gosh, absolutely wonderful. Just a little something about me. I actually lived in Dallas for a while, and my daughter was living there during that time. I actually went to get her, I think, in May of 2021. So condolences from all of us on your loss. And it's absolutely amazing that you are turning that into action through your career and how you can help others. It's absolutely inspiring. Thank you so much. So now, yes. So now I want to ask if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask Dr. Durr any questions. MA, you should have a question because, child, you all up in the comments.
I am, oh Lord, like I'm just having a moment. I'm so sorry. I just want to thank you, Dr. Durr, because you are so inspirational. I don't want to use that word because so many people use it, and I don't want to put you in the box. But for me, you are doing the work that I see and I value, and I want to do this type of work. And for a very long time, I couldn't make the connection because I was like, I have to carve out pieces of myself to fit in to what I see as a data scientist, in this role. I'm just a beginner. I'm just starting this journey. And just being here with you today and just being here in the other sessions this week, I'm kind of like, I don't know how to say it, but it's like I'm kind of reconnecting to myself, reconnecting to my Blackness, understanding that I have value. So I'm so thankful to you to do this presentation because it's so important. It's so critical. The way that you wove in all the different economic factors, the points that you made about joy, about safety, Like sometimes I'm doing work and I'm like, what am I doing it for? It's so hard. It really is very hard. But I know that you're there and the other people on this call are there and that the fight is so necessary. I'm not going to give up. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And yes, don't give up. We've got to keep fighting. And it starts with us as individuals, and just finding that joy as an act of resistance is more powerful than people realize, I think. And especially for people just coming into this space, it's important to think about how we can expand our understanding of our skill set far beyond utilizing our skills to be exploited by these organizations that, want our talent but don't necessarily want us to bring our full authentic selves to the conversation at the same time. So hopefully this will be the first of many conversations we have about this topic and how we can mobilize our skill sets to do more to contribute to the conversation. So thank you for being here and participating, and for your amazingly kind words as well. And if anybody else has any, even if you just have like recommendations for any particular books that you've come across or any particular organizations beyond Data for Black Lives, feel free to share those in the chat. I would love to bring even more pieces into the conversation that we can all learn from and weave into our own work towards being better data activists.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm a data scientist and I have a business, and I guess I never saw what I was doing. I never categorized it as activism. I have more of a generational wealth perspective, but that is a part of activism as well. So my goal here, I'm in South Carolina, is to train the next generation of data professionals. So the data scientists, the data analysts, because I do recognize when I go on conferences or, even enter certain spaces, I'm still the only one, but it's a nice paying field. So it's like I saw it as, helping them with generational wealth and putting them in spaces that they never thought they would be in. But no, like that is activism. That is a way to change the trajectory of their family. That is a way to make sure that they have money to be able to make decisions, because I really like how you highlighted that when you have money, you have more power to make more decisions. And so getting more money, getting more power to the right people, to be able to move the narrative forward. So thank you so much for your presentation and be able to piece it all together in such a beautiful way.
Thank you, Dr. Josie, and I'll have to check out your talk as well. It sounds like you had your own contribution to this conversation that I would love to hear as also. And thank you so much for doing the work that you're doing to train the next generation, because I think that is critical. But training them by people who look like them is also important, just as important, I think, too.
I just want to say, as one of the curators of Black and Data Week, I am so glad I had you, Dr. Josie and Dr. Durr, that y'all have really just turned it out. So thank you so much. I just had to give that shout out again to Dr. Josie, and that's it. Thanks. Thank you.
I'm so glad to see all these entrepreneurs too, because I think that's also a recurring theme that you're seeing in this community. And I think that is an amazing piece of this data activism conversation, because I myself started my own nonprofit in 2019, where we were focused on doing consulting for nonprofits, educational organizations, and government agencies. And I think just as important as it is to train us to work for other people, it's important to train us to actually take those data skills and work for ourselves. So thank you to everyone on that panel for pushing that piece of the conversation forward, just alongside the piece that we become more skilled as data professionals. We need to become just as skilled as being entrepreneurs so that we own the type of data that we get to work with.
Dr. Durr, this is Pierre Du Bois. Just want to say thank you very much for your presentation. Really loved a lot of the points you brought up, particularly about the color of change. I had seen a couple of times, but to be honest with you, I have not really had a chance to kind of understand. But this, even mentioning that was really great. And I just want to say thank you for doing this presentation, and you honor your mom by being here and providing such wonderful information for all of us to share, think about, reflect, and incorporate into how we operate as well. And I also want to say I like the fact that you also noted about the GDP and just kind of the concept that tends to, sometimes with a metric, we tend to mask over the issues that are impacting our community. And sometimes it's not done with necessarily with a malice. It's also done with the idea that a lot of the economic challenges that we face as a people are tied into some larger picture things going on. And we have to kind of, it's always that tension. And we have to kind of learn how to keep that tension such that we're understanding what's going on and how to circle that back. And I think that's the biggest thing I take away from your presentation. So thank you for doing this. Thank you for being here. I love it. And thank you very, very much.
Thank you. And I appreciate that. And that's the goal, so that's what I was hoping from this presentation. So I appreciate y'all, and I appreciate that you guys got the message that I was trying to send into the data community. I just want to say thank you to Kim also one more time for having me. I'm just so grateful to be here and be able to share my testimony with y'all. And please connect with me on LinkedIn as well. I'd love to keep the conversation going. And hopefully this is going to be, like I said, the first of many conversations that we have about data activism moving forward.
So with that, I want to thank everybody for coming out. I want to thank Dr. Durr again for jumping on board very early with wanting to participate. And again, our apologies for not getting it out there a little bit sooner, but we've doing as much as we can to promote this talk. This is absolutely wonderful. We typically have really great talks for Black and data justice. And this year, I think has been the best one in terms of talks, and not to diss anyone from the previous years, but it's just been a wonderful week. And I want to thank you again for participating and hope that you come back for some other things that we plan to do. And I want to thank, so everyone, again, thank you for joining us, and thank you for supporting us this week. Everyone, please be safe and have a great day.